We're going to start with sharing a little handout that will just give you some of the proper names and terms I'll be using, so you'll have them in front of you. So our first technical task is going to be drop that in the chat. And this is a Google Doc. I assume you should be able to open it, but let me just get a quick, whoever gets in there first and is able to see it, just let me know in case it's working. Good. Okay, so that's just, you know, so you have some of these references in front of you, and I'll be using two French words or phrases, which I pronounce so you can get used to that. So I want to say this is a kind of vaguely alluded to in the talk description. This talk focuses on newspapers and the way that creative writers engaged with them roughly around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. But it's also all meant as a sort of a grand allegory or a big analogy. What I imagine, some of you might be curious about newspapers the way I am. I want to pursue this. But I also want you to think about the new media, whatever we call that, in part social media, but everything that is on the big network that we're all plugged into, and as a matter of fact, through which I am communicating to you now. And part of the thinking for me comes from, you know, what does it mean to, for example, post a poem on Instagram, or write a novel serially in installments on Substack? Or even what does it mean to read a book on a screen with pixels or that funny magnetic ink I hear about? But that is, you know, sort of for you to think about and digest. I sometimes think with these kinds of things, it is better to not go directly at it, but to come up with a different example through which we can approach the question at an oblique angle. So I'll leave you with that thought and get into what I've got prepared for you. There are still newspapers, but paper newspapers are generally bad. We don't, at least I don't, look to them for inspiration. And for the most part, the newspapers we encounter are emulations, and the way a touch screen emulates a keyboard. And we don't use the keyboard in the way that what it emulates was used. Right? Typing on an emulated keyboard on your phone or tablet is not like typing on a keyboard of a computer or a typewriter, certainly. There used to be something called touch typing for mechanical typewriters, which you cannot do on an emulated keyboard. To wander a little farther afield, think about the synthesizer, the musical instrument. When they were invented, basically they were a bunch of wires and knobs. That was the way to manipulate them. At some point, someone got the idea that it would be easier for musicians to use them if they attached something that looked like a piano keyboard to them. Because more people understood how to make music on a keyboard. That is, if you knew how to play the piano, you could play the synthesizer, or at least, you know, have a way to interface with this new device that made other sounds. But it didn't have to be a piano-like keyboard. The interface with the synthesizer could have been something that looked like a harp, or something that looked like a flute. And there are actually interesting experiments. If you look up the theremin, I didn't put that in my handout. That was an example, not really synthesizer, it's a little earlier, but it's an example where music is made with the hands, with gesture. Okay, so back to newspapers. An emulated newspaper in an app that shows quote unquote newspaper headlines is an example of a medium inside another medium. The app houses the newspaper. The name of the newspaper survives maybe as a brand or as a kind of echo of how the newspaper was read. And in some sense, this compression has been going on for a while because newspapers kept making the print smaller, and they themselves converged more for economic and sometimes political reasons. In many cities, you have these newspapers with combined names like the Star Tribune, the Journal Constitution, the Press Enterprise, the Herald Sun, the Times Picayune. And in all these cases, there were two newspapers that merged, and now you have one with one name. So maybe the step to the app is kind of another step of that sort. So we'd have to ask ourselves what it means that the newspaper is the content of an app or podcast. So I want to put some pictures in front of you. I have a nice slideshow prepared because so much of this talk is about form. There we go. So let's magnify so we get one page at a time. So this, according to one book I read, is the oldest newspaper, the first newspaper, German, 1609. And now I'm going to do a quick run through of a couple of successive stages of what newspapers looked like. So this one is Courant or News from Italy, Germany, Hungary, Spain, and France, 1621. You see, what's the big change here? 2 columns. Okay, now this is an American one. Public occurrences, both foreign and domestic. This is from 1690. We have the 2 columns again. And then we get the more familiar look. I chose this even though it's blurry because I thought in terms of thinking about the form, it would be even better. As the writer of the book notes, this is the London Times, the first newspaper printed on a power press. So the power press allows the compression, and now we have 5 columns of very little text. And finally, just because it's fun, I found this one. The Black Hills Weekly Pioneer from Deadwood. If you've ever seen the show Deadwood, this was the place where that was, a little newspaper. And we see many of the visual elements we're more familiar with, the big title, headlines, subheadlines, shorter items, 6 columns in this case. So we'd have to ask what it means that a newspaper is the content of an app or a podcast. My broader idea here, and you can see the quote from the media theorist Marshall McLuhan at the beginning of the handout. He considered that the content of a new medium is always an older medium. So TV plays movies. Early movies were filmed plays. Plays give structure to song and recitation and so on. So thinking about it this way, the content of the newspaper, as I'm about to talk about in a little more detail, is probably letters and telegrams, which are a particular kind maybe of sped up letters, and also prints and photographs, and to some extent also literature. So we can ask ourselves, what were newspapers when they were new, when the idea itself was novel? Well, probably the first thing included, as I said, was the letters. So there's already a kind of existing phenomenon where people communicated through letters, and letters sometimes were not merely private, but communicated news that were a public affair, information that was important to many. So to choose a non-literary example, businessmen would keep up with events in other states or countries that were important to their business via letter. And if one person received a letter with important price, information about the price of grain or, something like that, then it would make sense to distribute this, not merely by passing it around, but by making copies. So some of the earliest things that are like newspapers are actually handwritten copies of letters that were circulated. And interestingly, these were made into, you know, little folios. So there would just be like one sheet that was folded to make 4 pages, but the 4th page was blank because if anything new had happened, you as the owner of the newspaper, quote unquote, could write it at the end, so the next person that saw it would get the details. Eventually we get this idea of, okay, let's just print the letters, and maybe let's pay the person that writes the letters, and then they become, what do we call, you know, one of the old words for journalist is a correspondent. They're a person that writes letters from somewhere. And this is, of course, why we still have the word newsletter. So as time passed on, the second important medium incorporated is the telegraph. So as with letters, so with telegrams, it's a faster way to send information. And again, as with letters, most telegram communication was private, but some of them were important enough to be made public. The telegraph worked on a wire network, so the news came over the wire, and this is where we get, you know, the phrase is still in use, wire reports and so on. And of course, we can add other things that eventually arrived in the newspaper from the very beginning. And that first one I showed you, you saw there was a print. So early ones had prints as illustrations, and then drawings, and eventually photographs and so on. So let's take a step back and try to think about, I'm trying to think about the newspaper as a medium and as a form, because that, I think, is one of the 2 main ways that creative writers encountered it and tried to think about it. So I'm going to give you two kinds of examples. One is from a perhaps slightly satirical essay by the Czech writer Karel Čapek. If you know him at all, it is because he wrote the play R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots. He was the one who coined the term robot. It's a very charming play about a bunch of robots who revolt and take over the factory they're working in and kill the factory owners. Spoiler alert, I should have said. Okay, but he wrote this essay in praise of newspapers, where he says, we're too familiar with them. No longer do we look at them as a daily wonder. So why would the newspaper bring wonder, especially to a creative writer who presumably is steeped in poetry and literature, which is it is most likely to bring wonder? He says, the newspaper world is made up of exceptional events, unusual cases, and frequently of miracles and wonders. The newspaper brings the news, and the news is always what is striking or what appears at the moment to be singular. And this brings him to a contrast between literature and newspapers. He says literature is the expression of old things in eternally new forms, while the newspapers are eternally expressing new realities in a stabilized and unchangeable form. So literature, old things in new forms, and newspaper, new realities in a stabilized and unchangeable form. But this brings him to think, well, maybe a lot of what we think of as literature was actually closer to the newspaper. But for example, he says, what have we thought about the epic poems of Homer, like the Iliad, which documents a war as a kind of journalism, given that the events documented in that epic poem were relatively new when Homer wrote them down or sang them, depending on whether you think Homer wrote or someone else wrote down his singing. Okay, so my second example is the poet Mallarmé, although right now I'm going to talk about some of his essays. By the time that Mallarmé was looking into them, Mallarmé is a little earlier than Čapek, early 20th century. There was no question for Mallarmé that more people were reading newspapers than books. And you will find this familiar, perhaps. The sentiment was that people were excited and distracted by the short snippets of information they got in the newspapers and were paying less attention to books. So the newspaper both distracted the readers of books, and also when they got around to the book, they brought a short attention span that was built by the newspaper. He has two essays in that are collected in this book here. It's called Divagations, although they were originally published in newspapers. You'll see the first French term I have there is feuilleton. So the different newspapers did this in different ways, but in the French newspaper, the bottom, quarter maybe of the page, there was a line, and there'd be a couple of columns of literature. So there could be stories, like part of a novel, an installment of a novel, or poems, or literary criticism. And this is how Mallarmé's stuff got stuck in the newspaper. So in these essays, the two ones I want to talk about is the book, A Spiritual Instrument, and another one called Displays, which is about the displays of books in shop windows, or at least kind of sets off from meditating on that. He kind of adopts the style of the writers of these kind of the feuilleton, of this kind of light insertion of literature or criticism into the newspapers, and talks in this kind of, if you read the essays, they're very strange, they're kind of digressive, and it's a little bit hard to know what the point he's making is. And I think he's doing this on purpose. It's as though he knows the reader is distracted, and so he is, instead of trying to capture the writer's attention, he himself is going to write in a distracted manner. The idea is that he's going to sort of interact with the context, right, with what's around his writing on the page. But he notes that this kind of distraction has almost a sort of physical form. And in one very beautiful image, he contrasts the way that a book's pages are bound together, they're sewn together, and so they're stuck together in a particular order, whereas the newspaper's pages are merely folded. And he talks about a newspaper, you set it down on a park bench and there's a breeze and all the pages kind of fly off, something that can't happen with a book. The newspaper is more likely to fall apart, be dismantled, be cut up, or even fly away. And of course, we know one bunch of people that noticed this and took advantage of it, the Cubists, Braque, Picasso, and so on, who incorporated newspapers into their collages and seemed to acknowledge the visual element of the newspaper as texture, but also as a scene of everyday life, right? So this collage we're looking at here, you could look at, among other things, as, a top-down view of a table on which a newspaper had been spread out and the pages had been moved around. This page seems to be right side up. This one seems to be upside down. There's another collage. In this one, the newspaper seems to be used more as a kind of background, but there's this kind of dance of the other elements, which, among other things, you could look at as trying to mimic the movement of the distracted eye over the newspaper page. So I'm going to come back to Mallarmé and show you a poem that he made that I think reflects his thinking on the newspaper. But I would recommend to you these two essays, Displays, and the book, A Spiritual Instrument. They're very rich and wonderful examples. So to kind of focus the talk, I decided to take one element and make it my main spot of engagement, and that's going to be headlines. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of other examples. But the next 7 examples are all places where I see creative writers engaging with this question of newspaper as form, and the challenge that the newspaper reader, the reader habituated to the news as presented in the newspaper, the challenge that reader poses to the writer, right? People that have been trained to read in another way come and read your fiction or your poems. And instead of pretending that that's not happening, and we have some magical autonomous world called literature that's safe from all of this, I see these writers engaging creatively with the form of the newspaper. So if we think about headlines, just to sum up what I said earlier, the newspaper you could see as a collection of letters, which we now call articles, wire reports, that are printed under larger headings, often in bold text or all caps, right? Those would be the headlines. The first thing you would see flipping through a newspaper and skimming its pages are headlines. Probably the other are photographs or whatever form of illustration it has. Then there's a kind of visual cascade to secondary headlines into the articles, but you might not read the whole article. Of course, there's ads, and this all follows, the cascade follows a decreasing size, but is also affected by the placement on the page. But also there's I think a diminishing rate of returns with attention, so you're likely to read more carefully on page 1 than on page 21. So keeping all that in mind, let's look at some examples. So the first one comes from the Russian writer, Soviet-era Russian writer, Viktor Shklovsky. This is from a book called Third Factory. And Shklovsky wrote many of these books that are extremely hard to classify in terms of genre. So let's see. So there's the cool cover for an older edition of this. I don't know what got it, how they got it in their heads to trade that cover for this one. But whatever, that's fashion for you. Okay, so let's just read a little bit of the beginning of the book. It begins with this text called "I Continue." I'll just read a little bit of it to you. I speak in a voice grown hoarse from silence and feuilletons. I'll begin with a piece that has been lying around for a long time. The way you assemble a film by attaching to the beginning either a piece of exposed negative or a strip from another film. I'm attaching a piece of theoretical work, the way a soldier crossing a stream holds his rifle high. It will be completely dry as a cough. So a couple of observations here. First, one of the things that I noticed that brings this immediately close to the newspaper is Shklovsky's extremely short paragraphs, usually 1 or 2 sentences at a time. The second are his writing in the present tense and the references to events. So as the book unfolds, what he talks about in the second paragraph, assembling a film, he's working in a factory, in a film factory. So that's the third factory of the title. And he connects the idea of assembling films to his work as a writer. So I'm going to skip down a little bit. Wit, the unexpected denouement, for example, had no place in the anecdote of that time. Now we describe an anecdote as a short novella with a denouement. From our viewpoint, to ask after hearing an anecdote, what happened next is an absurdity. But then that is the viewpoint of our time. In the old days, one anecdotal fact was normally followed by another. In the old anecdote, one responded above all to the attractiveness of the fact, to the material, whereas in the modern anecdote, we respond mainly to the structure. And I'm thinking here that when he says anecdote, he means that event that is briefly related in a newspaper. I'll connect this later to the notion of faits divers, the this and that section of the newspaper, where you get like this happened, but there's no more detail. Why? Because tomorrow's newspaper hasn't been published yet. This is all we know so far. So we respond mainly to the structure, meaning we don't look for more information. We just look at the surrounding context. This conflict, or rather the alternation of perception from one aspect of a work to another, can be traced easily. I have no desire to be witty, I have no desire to construct a plot. I'm going to write about things and thoughts to compile quotations. Okay, and I'm going to leave that section there. Let's look at, so as you read the book, that section ends there. It's just a page and a half. Then you have First Factory, which is the first section of the book. And then we're going to look at how the book begins. So immediately we notice that the book is made up of these. It's a little easier to see if I show you the spread, right? But it's made up of these little sections that are a little bit like two columns of articles, each with their little heading. So it starts, about a red elephant. Red elephant, my son would be lost without you. I'm letting you into my book ahead of the others to keep them in their place. The red elephant is squeaking. All rubber toys are supposed to squeak. Why else would the air come out? And so, Brame notwithstanding, the red elephant is squeaking. And I, perched high in my nest above the arbate, I'm writing. No bird could scale these heights without huffing and puffing. Here in my nest, I have learned not to be long-winded. My son is laughing. He started laughing the first time he saw a horse. He thought it was doing 4 legs and a long nose just for fun. We are cranked out in various shapes, but we speak in one voice when pressure is applied. Red elephant, step aside. I want to see life seriously and to say something to it in a voice not filtered through a squeaker. Here ends the feuilleton. So that little remark there at the end of this strange story, here ends the feuilleton, is more or less telling you, read this like the newspaper. You just got to the front page and looked down at the bottom to find the feuilleton, the funny story that was included to contrast or complement the news. And after that silly story, he does the thing that would happen if you then moved, from the feuilleton to a very serious article, which has the title, I write about how objective reality determines consciousness while the conscience remains in disarray. And this one turns out to be about letter writing. So I'm not going to read the whole thing in interest of time, but I want to show you how it ends. I am leaking like a frayed rubber hose. The book will be called Third Factory. So there we have, in this very subtle way, the headings just went from being separate from the text to that last phrase is interrupted and has no punctuation. The book will be called Third Factory. So the headline is kind of grabbed and incorporated into the previous one, even as it does its function of announcing the next one. And all of these things I'm trying to suggest are Shklovsky playing with elements of the newspaper. And if you take the time to read Third Factory, which I do recommend, it is a very puzzling and curious book, he is thinking about being a worker in a factory and a factory that makes film. And he's thinking about handling the materials of creative work, dealing with not just the formal, but actually the material elements, and then trying to take those insights back into his work as a writer. Okay, so now our second example. So this is an anthology made by Jorge Luis Borges and Adolfo Bioy Casares called Libro del Cielo y del Infierno. This one isn't in English, The Book of Heaven and Hell. And Borges collaborated with Bioy Casares to make a number of anthologies on different topics. And what you will see, well, I always like to tell people, even if you don't read a language, you should look at the pages. I know some of you have some Spanish, but in any case, this is what you get when you look at it, when you just open it up to the beginning. So you could say it's an anthology of quotes about heaven and hell, but what Bioy Casares and Borges did is they added these kind of titles, but I want to call them also headlines. And interestingly, as it happens, this is the edition that I happen to own, which is a more recent one. But in this one, the editors chose to put these one to a page. So you miss the effect you know, that the 2-page spread has of little bits with headings all kind of running together. So I'm just going to translate a little bit the titles and the quotes under them, or in some cases I don't have to translate because the originals are in English. But so the first one is The Place of the Sun, S-O-N, and Tennyson, do you think that I care for my soul if my boy be gone to the fire? Skipping one down, Eve's Epitaph, written by Adam. And this is from a work by Mark Twain called Eve's Diary. Wheresoever she was, there was Eden. And then, let's see, next page. The Test. And the quote is from Coleridge. If a man could pass through paradise in a dream and have a flower presented to him as a pledge that his soul had really been there, and if he found that flower in his hand when he awoke, aye, and what then? So we have a very, very subtle gesture, right? What are they doing if this entire book is made up of other people's words? Parenthetically, it might not be other people's words because Borges and Bioy like to cheat and stick things in that they wrote and attributed to other people. But supposing the bulk of it is by other people, there is the selection of the material and the ordering, but there's also these titles. That is really what they wrote here, are these headings. And of course, there are other examples, the newspaper headlines of headings. But I am going to say that part of the way that the reader is habituated to reading short bits is by them having a headline. And with the headline, one can announce what's coming, one can contrast, one can draw attention to a certain element, one can even contradict or criticize it. And I think all of these things are happening in different bits here in this book. Okay, my third example, again, thinking about the incorporation of headlines, this is maybe the most famous one, and it comes from James Joyce's novel Ulysses. There's an episode in Ulysses where the character Bloom goes to the office of the Freeman's Journal newspaper to place an ad. And as you see in the 2-page spread I'm showing you here, right as the there is a kind of page break, even though it's not a chapter break, and all of a sudden the entire page is broken up by headlines. And I didn't scan a bunch of them, but you can see how it looks here. You get page after page. It goes on for about 30 pages where the narration is broken up with headlines. It's like they're in the newspaper office, Bloom is talking to newspaper men, and everyone has newspaper mind. And the headlines are, they start out as kind of serious, stodgy newspaper headlines, and then they become sillier and more parodic. So for example, this is page 115. By the time you get to page 145, you have KMA and KMRIA, which turns out KMA, will you tell him he can kiss my ass? And then KMRIA, he can kiss my Royal Irish ass. Well, of course, this is more fun if you're reading along, but I think that this is an example, again, I mean, Joyce made this very literal by having this take place in the newspaper office. But as you read through, you can read the chapter or this section of the chapter and ignore the headlines, and you get, you know, this kind of wonderful narration that Ulysses has overall. But then you look at the headlines and you see this kind of commentary on the way that consciousness or perception is shaped by the newspaper and the segmentation of events and anecdotes, which is in fact what happens, you know. And even this KMA as a headline is almost like the headline turning into gossip. Like, you know what Miles Crawford said? He said he can kiss my ass. He said he can kiss my Royal Irish ass. I guess it should be ass, but I can't quite pronounce it. Okay, so recommend that to you. And now back to our friend Mallarmé. I have a different little slideshow for that, but I'm going to talk about his poem. And again, we're going to look at untranslated text, which is, I think, very helpful when thinking about form. This is its publication in book form, Un coup de dé jamais n'abolira la hasard, or a throw of the dice will never abolish chance. So one of the things, there's a contradictory anecdotes about Mallarmé. Supposedly he hated the newspapers and especially hated headlines. But then in other places, he comments that he likes them or is absorbed by them. So first, I'm just going to do a little show and tell flip through of the book, which we can do thanks to our magical online resources. I say book, it's a poem published as a book. So let's grab it. Okay, so again, take advantage. I mean, some of you may know French or have read this poem in translation, but take advantage of, if you don't, of your capacity to look at the formal elements. So I'm going to do one flip through without talking, and then talk again. All right. So one of the things is that some of you may be. This was probably one of the first poems to really move words around on the page. And Mallarmé had not, the poems he wrote before this look, whatever. They're spaced in a much more ordinary way. He wasn't trying these typographical experiments. So one of the things, if you keep in mind, and we just simply try to think about the title, right? Un coup de dé, jamais n'abolira pas le hasard. A throw of the dice will never abolish chance. And we think of it as a kind of headline. This was actually this font here. It was a headline font that you would have found in newspapers of the time. So we are kind of invited with our newspaper consciousness or newspaper mind to scan across the page. And one of the things about this is that this page, which acts as the, not the title page and the cover page, but the inside title page, is actually the beginning of the poem. So if we retain this visual of un coup de dé, jamais, there's the next word of the title. We keep flipping through. N'abolira, there's the next word of the title. Le hasard. So the title is actually spread out in this font. And if you read only looking for that headline font, you can construct the title as a line in the poem, or rather the title kind of flips into or dips into the poem. And although we don't have time, you've seen there are a couple of other typographical features. I'm not even talking about the spacing. I'm just talking about the size and the capitalization of the fonts, right? So we have here, most of the poem is in lowercase, but the lowercase appears with or without italics. Then we have this all caps, but smaller, right? Kind of like a subtitle, and so on. So in a way, you could think about what Mallarmé did with this poem. I mean, there's a bunch of ways to think about it, but if we stay on this newspaper idea, he took this mind, or these eyes that were trained to scan across newspaper pages, pick up the size of headlines and the type of typography, and used it to make a poem that looks exactly unlike a newspaper, in the sense that we don't have neat text organized in columns. But you can read it both in, you know, I read the first page, then I read the second page, then I read the next page, or you can scan across the way I was showing you with the example of the title, although I think you can actually do it with the other typographical elements as well. So it has like headings, subheadings. It's using this newspaper consciousness, right? And at the same time, reorganizing. Okay, and just in case you want to flip in this through yourself, let me drop the link to what I was flipping through in the chat. All right, so the second half of this is going to be much quicker. I just want to go through a couple of examples of writers, creative writers, responding to newspaper form by writing into or for newspapers. Yeah, and this is just to emphasize that other aspect, not just to pick it up and run with it and put it somewhere else, but to put something directly in a newspaper. So the first example is this is called Novels in 3 Lines by Félix Fénéon, although it is in fact, that is not the form in which he published it. So Fénéon had a job at a newspaper and published stuff that looks like this. Oh no, I'm sharing the wrong page. There we go. Okay. So in the right-hand column, you will see it says Nouvelles en 3 lignes. That would be novels in 3 lines, or probably more likely news in 3 lines. But interestingly, the two words are the words ambiguous. And so you have, first of all, you notice his name is not signed to it. It doesn't say by Félix Fénéon. This is basically, his job was that they would get these telegraph reports about stuff that happened in some department in France. And he would just write. He's like, okay, here's what happened in Paris. Here's what happened in this area. Here's what happened abroad. And he would write these little brief things. Now, probably no one would have known. He was mainly an art critic, so no one would have known that he was doing this for his day job. It just so happened his friends really liked them and collected them. And later on, you know, they were acknowledged as having like enormous kind of creative value. So let me show you a translation of them. This is an excerpt from the book that I just showed you, Luc Santé's translation. Can you see this okay, or should I blow up one of the columns? It might be a little... Let's look at maybe just one column. News in 3 lines. A criminal virago, Mademoiselle Toul, was sentenced by the Rouen court to 10 years hard labor while her lover got 5. Nurse Elise Bachmann, whose day off was yesterday, put on a public display of insanity. Women suckling their infants argued the workers' cause to the director of the streetcar lines in Toulon. He was unmoved. Scheid of Dunkirk fired 3 times at his wife. Since he missed every shot, he decided to aim at his mother-in-law and connected. The May Day celebration in Lorient was noisy, but not a hint of violence gave the slightest cause for police intervention. His head injury was not serious, believed Kramer of Pont-à-Mousson, who continued working for a few hours, then dropped dead. I could have done worse, exultantly cried the murderer Lebret, sentenced at Rouen to hard labor for life. So, you know, if you read just one of these by itself, you might not notice Fénéon's, what he added to it in terms of style. He wasn't just anonymous in the sense that he didn't sign it, and it's not like a particular choice of his. These were unsigned items. It's the same way that no one signs the police blotter in the local newspaper. These are just the faits divers. They're the little anecdotes that, as Shklovsky points out, you know, there's no more to the story because this is all that came over the wire. But what did Fénéon do? Well, he wrote it, right? So, for example, the you know, the one that ends, he continued working for a few hours, then dropped dead. It's almost a kind of dark punchline, you know. Whereas I could have done worse, exultantly cried the murderer Lebret, sentenced at Rouen to hard labor for life, right? It begins with the quote, and then like, who's saying this? Why? And then it fills it out. So they are like, you know, mini novels. They're micro novels. Each of these might be like, you know, either the plot of a novel is to find out like, how did we get to this? Or if this happened, what comes after? But that's all sort of left up to your imagination. All he delivered were these little bits, right? So that is Fénéon's novel in 3 lines, and you know, was collected and translated here by Luc Santé, who also wrote a very, very nice introduction. Okay, second example of writing directly to the newspaper. The poet Charles Olson lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and was very concerned with the history of Gloucester and the present day life of Gloucester. And he wrote many letters to the editor of the Gloucester Daily Times. But as a poet, he did not feel like he needed to write the letters in prose. So, for example, in this one from 1965, it's a poem that begins, a scream to the editor, moan the loss, another house is gone, bemoan the present, which assumes its taste, bemoan the easiness of smashing anything, moan Solomon Davis's house gone for the YMCA. To build another of its cheap, benevolent places bankers raise money for, and who loan money for new houses. Each destruction doubles our loss, and doubles bankers' gains when 4 columns bemoan a people who spend beyond themselves to flourish and further themselves. Okay, and it keeps going. So Olson, you know, what is kind of the fundamental thing here? He is a guy who lives in a city who's mad that they knocked down a house for the YMCA, and he's writing a letter to the editor. I mean, in the world of newspapers, this would have been the most common event. I guess it maybe still happens in some places. But he's also the poet Charles Olson, so he sends them a poem. The letter to the editor is a poem. There's 2 of these in Olson's selected letters. There's also a book of all his letters to the editor of the Gloucester Daily Times, which unfortunately you have to find in a library because it's very out of print. But the other one that's in the selected letters is in a kind of prose. It sort of resembles the prose that Olson wrote. Dear editor, happy poet, like my friend Stephen Jonas, the Boston poet, says, I was raised over the cut, and except for the Parsons Morse house I tried to buy last year in a Granville Ray Morrison covered up a few years back, there never has been any reason to talk about the light, or at least the houses as fixing it by texture or color, or by their dignity or loveliness and shape or bearing. Again, I mean, the minimum I'd want you to pick up from this is not a conventional letter to the editor. And if you read Olson's letters, this is how he writes his friends. So he's, again, using the style, using the format of, I get to publish a letter to the editor and it goes in the newspaper, but look at how it's written. Okay, and my last example, so I don't need to do any more slideshow for that. My last example is actually an example of a feuilleton. This is the novel The Salt Smugglers by Gérard de Nerval, which was published, as I was saying, in the feuilleton section, you know, in the French newspaper at the bottom of the page. And Archipelago Press were immensely clever by publishing this in this book, where the novel itself is in 2 columns. So you get part of that visual experience of what it would have been like to read it at the bottom of the newspaper page, and kind of flipping through it feels like that. So some of the features of the Salt Smugglers is that it was published in by a French newspaper called Le National, and it's framed as an epistolary novel. Now, of course, there's a separate history of the epistolary novels that are constructed as letter exchanges. But in Nerval's novel, it's framed as letters to the editor. So although it's fictional, the fictional author is writing letters to the editor. And it includes, it's not only, I mean, again, you probably know about, for example, like Dickens published some of his novels serially in newspapers. So it has some elements of that. But one of the things that makes Nerval's Salt Smugglers especially interesting is that he keeps sticking other elements into the novel, breaking up the narrative. So there's fictional police reports, catalog entries, bits of historical books, inscriptions from tombstones, and he also sticks in poems. So even the way that the feuilleton, breaks up the page, like here's the news, here's the fiction at the bottom, he then inside of that starts putting in stuff that you might find in other parts of the newspaper. So he's hyper conscious that this isn't a newspaper and is just having fun with it, sticking in these various different elements. So there's other examples of this, but I want to share the Salt Smugglers mainly just because I love this visual decision of publishing the novel with columns. You also see these breaks. These breaks represent where the actual breaks of the installments were. So you kind of you get a sense of sort of how he broke it up. I was about to say organically, but probably not organically, probably just based on word count. Okay, so amazingly, I managed to prepare this in such a way that I just got through everything I wanted to share with you all. So I hope you like my talk and my show and tell. Any thoughts or questions or comments? I know we have a little time. Yeah, go ahead, Aurora.
Oh, let me turn my... Well, I'd like to have a really profound question, but I can't. I love all of this. I like, because I was trained in journalism when I was really young, and creative work seems like a separate thing to me, and trying to get them to work together through a sense of play makes a lot of sense. On the titles being larger in descending order, and also there's supposed to be traditionally a limit of 3 different size forms of text on a page so that people don't get too overwhelmed, confused. But it made me think about subverting that hierarchy and doing layout where the size of text isn't in descending order. And I also like to occasionally in my poems, I like to put them in a form where there is more than one possible track for the eye to follow. So you can read it in different orders or different ways. And so I liked that idea of knowing that your reader is distracted, and instead of holding their hand, kind of dishing it back, maybe.
Yeah. Nice.
So, really inspiring.
Thank you. Before we go to Asala, I meant to say, just with the Mallarmé, I dropped the link there to the one I was doing the slideshow of because I thought it was cool to look at the original. There's several translations of that in English if you want to read the poem in English. Wade Books did a book one, and then in different anthologies of Mallarmé, you'll almost always find it. Go ahead, Asala.
Yeah, well, quick. I just want to say, for some reason my keyboard's not working. Well, actually, I know it's getting old, but so I will say it here. So it was an amazing way to look at it, because I too thought for journalism it's very formal. So seeing this, having it to be, especially the example you just showed us, having 2 novels in 2 columns, that's the coolest thing. I thought it was so cool. So thank you so much for sharing this, Alejandro. I had so much fun being in the space with you, and learning about this. So this is really cool.
Thank you. All right. We're at the hour, so unless there's any other comments or questions, I think we can call it. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alejandro.